All right, thanks for hanging in there, everyone. We have our two special guests tonight have come from out of state, so they were in transit when this event started. So I'm delighted that they're both here. I'm going to introduce our next panel and then get out of the way and let Kelly take over. So first, let me introduce our moderator, my friend Kelly, who I also want to publicly thank. Kelly has been another absolute advocate for 1455 and my endeavor. She's introduced me to a bunch of people, has been a tireless supporter. It was very important to me to make her a part of this festival, so I'm thrilled and honored that you're here to do this. And this panel is Writing After 50, so I can't wait to hear what's about to happen. Kelly is a late blooming writer whose work has appeared in Some, Memoir, Mixtapes, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and Corvus Review, among others. She's currently working on an MFA from the Bluegrass Writers Studio at Eastern Kentucky University. She teaches in the Media and Communications Department at Shenandoah, where she implores her students to listen to the words and not just nod to the beat. Directly next to her is Zia. Zia Wesley is the author of 9 books of nonfiction in the genre of health and beauty, as well as 2 historical novels, which are here this evening for sale. The Stolen Girl and the French Sultana, and the memoir Notes from a Broad, My Uncensored Year in Italy, which is also here, and I recommend any of those books highly. And directly next to me is Ronnie Citron Fink. She is the author of True Roots, What Quitting Hair Dye Taught Me About Health and Beauty from Island Press. She's also a contributor to A Glorious Freedom on being a woman, getting older, and living an extraordinary life. She works for the Environmental Defense Fund as the editorial director of the Moms Clean Air Force. Ronnie writes about the environment, health, politics, beauty, design, parenting, and education. She's written for In Style, USA Today, Huffington Post, Newsday, among other publications. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Ronnie, Zia, and Kelly, Writing After 50.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to pass this to you.
Oh, this is on. Okay, here we go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And if I can see a show of hands, I would like to see if anyone else in here considers themselves a late bloomer. All right, I've got some other, got some other late bloomers in the room. And that's part of what I think is important about the discussion that we're going to be having this evening, as we have some wonderfully accomplished writers who have embraced the fact that life does not stop at 40 and continues on. And one of the many things that we want to talk about is why we think it's special to embrace one's creativity after the age of 40, 50, and beyond.
Well, I'll take that. I'm way beyond. So I think that, you know the phrase, if you snooze, you lose? It really applies to aging. And I decided when I was probably 40-ish, maybe before I was 40, that I was going to get younger as I got older. And I think it's been a good plan. And I would recommend it to everybody. Not childish, but childlike. There's a difference. Sometimes I can be childish, though, right? But yeah, childlike rather than childish. I think that keeping your creativity and your sense of wonder keeps you young. And I'm probably living proof because should I tell them how old I am?
Please do, because
I'm 74.
Yeah. She's really. When I met you, you were 70. And I thought,
so
how
4
did
years
that
ago.
happen?
All right, so I'm going to pass it to Ronnie, but that's my secret. My secret is don't give in to the old man, as Clint Eastwood said, and definitely stay with creativity and a sense of wonder in everything, and you will stay young forever.
You. my age.
No.
I could. I'm 10 years younger. But I think that there's something that happens in midlife, whatever, and I'm not exactly sure what it is, but when I turned right around 50, I quit my job, and I had been writing for magazines, lots of different magazines, and along with being a teacher, I was a director of a private school, progressive private school for years before that. And I had decided, my husband is in the environmental field, and all of our dinner time conversations were not about the kids in my class, they were about what was happening in the world. And I decided that I wanted to just stop teaching. And of course, I wasn't working for a public school, so I didn't have that chunk of retirement and to hold on to. And I just stopped. I just stopped working, and I decided I was going to start writing and writing and writing. And that was my creative thing that I really wanted to do. And I found that when that there was something about that point, about reinventing myself, I guess, which seems, and I think it comes together, and I'm sure it comes together in men too, but I can only speak for women. I think there's just this like perfect storm of like the kid. I have 2 children, and had just started to like move out of the teenage years, and they were one was in college, and the other one was luckily moving out of the teenage years. And and then things start to change. You go through menopause, and life you look at life differently. You end up kind of like flipping the page. For me, I was like on overdrive, parenting, teaching, kind of keeping my creative life moving. And I like turned the page, and I like looked at this blank page, and I went, okay, the kids are gone, and like I'm not tied to that job anymore, and I can see what's next. And I actually kind of moved into a really interesting job with the Environmental Defense Fund with EDF, and when they said to me, "You want to be the editor?" I was like, I don't know how to be an editor. Like I was an English teacher, but like I was never an editor. So they said, well, you can do it. I think you can do it. And I just did it. And I actually feel stronger, more creative, smarter, and I have more energy to put into this now. So I don't know if that's all that you wanted, but
I think we'll go like this. I think you're making an important point, because we reach a certain age, and there's a phrase that's called you write from the scar and not from the wound.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're sort of past all of these things that maybe hurt you, or you've reached a point where you can be more reflective about the world. And I think that in that being reflective, it just makes us a little more interesting. There's not that sort of whiny thing that happens, right? I mean, you're talking about the world and seeing it through completely different eyes.
I think that by the time we reach 50, 50 was a turning point for me. I had already written 6 books by 50, but writing was not my first profession. I started the first organic natural skincare company in the U.S. in 1980. So I had started my company, run my company, developed products. I was in that whole arena. And I literally, between the age of 50 and 51, I literally lost my company to my partner, who took it in a hostile takeover. And this was what I had done for 15 years. It was all I had done besides write. And so at 51 actually, I had to reinvent myself completely. And I had purchased about 5 years earlier, I had purchased my first home, and it was in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, literally in the middle of nowhere. And when I lost my company, excuse me, I went to live in this farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, and I did all of the things that I had never had time to do when I was raising my daughter and starting the company and being an entrepreneur. So I created huge vegetable gardens in the desert, and it took 2 years to create soil to begin to even grow the vegetables. And I did all these things that, you know, I had imagined doing or dreamed of doing, but I never did. And that was a huge gift. And 2 years into that transformation, my personal transformation from entrepreneur to farmer, I started writing this story, which is we'll do a little show and tell. So this is the first book in the series, The Stolen Girl. And I had heard about this story, very little snippet of her story, 24 pages to be exact, in 1970. And I was so taken by this little snippet that I had, for the next 30 years, I had just kind of thought, somebody's going to write this. This is really going to be a really amazing story. This has to be the whole thing has to be fascinating. And I sat down one day and wrote one sentence, and then wrote for 10 hours a day for the next 2 years, without an internet, without a library, without any reference. I just made up this story. And 2 years after writing thousands of pages, I went back to California to visit my daughter and went to a library, spent a week in the library, and discovered that all these things that I had made up had actually happened, and I found the physical evidence for it. And the characters that I had made up existed. I didn't have the right names for a lot of them, but they actually existed. So writing at that point for me it didn't even feel like a choice. It was just kind of dumped on me, and I gladly received it. And I've been doing it ever since.
Was there a question?
Well, I think,
For me to talk about my book?
yeah, absolutely, you know,
About the
how
book and
you
book?
got
Yeah,
there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as I was sitting in a meeting at EDF in Washington, D.C. I live in New York. I live about 2 hours north of New York City in the Hudson Valley, Yep, which is where I live. And I was sitting in a meeting, and I had very long, very thick, very dark hair. It's about 4 or 5 years ago. And I have learned from my almost 10 years of working in the environmental field that everyone's quite young. In fact, the organizations are filled with mostly millennials. Obviously, I am not. And I felt I needed to stay young. I needed to stay fresh. I needed to have a certain, look about me. And I loved my long dark hair. It was like my beauty asset. And I was sitting in this meeting, and we were talking about the buildup of chemicals with a environmental health scientist, and we were talking about the buildup of chemicals in hair in women's bodies. And I was looked around the room, and I saw like my young colleagues like wiping the lipstick off. I saw them, kind of like checking their pocketbook to see, so nobody could tell that they were, refreshing. And I just went like this. I was like, oh my God. And I turned afterwards to the environmental health specialist, and I said, the scientist, and I said, so what's in hair dye? Just tell me. Because every time I have my hair dyed, and believe me, I had to do it often. This is what was underneath at that point. And so every 2 weeks, I had to keep refreshing. And women who do this know all about this whole cycle that we get kind of sucked into. And she said to me, this goes way beyond science and law. This gets into the beauty business, it gets into the regulatory business, and it's something that's never really been thoroughly investigated. So what's been investigated, I learned, so that's how the book started. That was the impetus for the book, and I thought, oh, and my boss turned to me, and my boss is Dominique Browning. I don't know if you know who she is. She writes for the New York Times, and she was the editor of House and Garden for 14 years before they closed, and she turned to me and she just said, start writing right now. And so I said, really? And she said, but first call the salon. So I called the salon, tell them that, you know, I'm canceling my hair color, and they're like, well, but you're like coming for these 911 appointments, because, you know, every few weeks I was having to do this. And I just started writing, and and the book started as a memoir. And once I started getting into the regulatory issues of the FDA and some of the science issues, I realized that the book was going beyond being a memoir. It was like encompassing a lot of science, a lot of politics, and because I work in politics, I work actually in political affairs department. So, you know, I do understand, I know about the regulatory system, I know what goes on in the Hill. I do know that our chemicals are not, the chemicals in cosmetics are not regulated. And, you know, we think this is America, and like, we must be safe, but actually our chemicals that are in hair products are not regulated. And the only testing that's been done has been on, because I had to do a lot of investigative work, has been on hairdressers. So I decided, because I don't actually write scientifically, I was an essayist, and I write in this very kind of light, I give it a light touch, and I really wanted to write a memoir, because I thought, oh, this is a great story. Here I have like two-tone hair, and I'm meeting people on the train, and they're, you know, people are asking me all these questions. Are you doing this on purpose? And, you know, like, what's going on with you? And like, why would you do that? Why would you do that to your beauty? And so I decided that I was going to find a publisher who would publish it with a personal narrative. And I got to have my agent. I actually quickly got an agent. So we can talk a little bit about the business side of it. So I had agents like kind of throwing themselves at me when I sent them the proposal, my proposal that I wrote, because I went to this writer's residency with Sean, and this is really interesting. I had never written a book before, so I had no idea what I was doing. Were you there when, what is her name, LaShonda?
No, it was
next year. The next year. So we met at this residency. So LaShonda was a Brown University professor of writing. And we sat around the table, the first, Sean and I were there, and there were probably 10 or 11 of us, and we sat around a table, and she said, I have a six-figure advance, and I need to write my book. And I was like, I remember I turned to you? I had no idea what a six-figure advance was. No idea. Meanwhile, she had this big advance, and we had dinner with her and never saw her again. Never. Except I saw her one morning at breakfast. And one morning she came down and she said, how are you doing? Because your book about hair dye, every woman needs to buy this, and I'm going to tell you how to get there. And I was like, really? And she grabs a paper towel, and she's in her like pajamas, and her hair's like up in this thing, and she grabs this paper towel, and she said, you need to write an outline. I was like, really? She said, and then you have to write a proposal. And I was like, really? I thought I'd just go, because my boss, who has written all these books, said, just go write the book. Go write the damn book. like, you're a good writer, just write the book. And I thought, okay, that's how people write books. But actually, that's not how people write books. People need agents, and they need publishers.
They don't need agents to write.
Oh, they don't need agents to write, but to get an advance, let's put it that way. I was like, I want an advance. Of course, I did not get a 6-figure advance from Island Press, but which is an environmental. I don't know if you know anything about Island Press, but Island Press does serious environmental books, and they took a real big leap on my book, which was very exciting. Anyway, so she interviewed me as if. And let me just tell you that I am at this point in my late 50s, and she's like 35. And she's interviewing me, and a professor at Brown. And she's interviewing me, and that became, I still have it, that became my outline. And that outline became my proposal, and that proposal got sent to agents. It got sent to 6 agents, and 4 offered me representation for the book. And the first agent I had didn't sell the book. She said, I'm going to get you on Oprah. This is so great. And I thought, yes, you're the one I want. So I went with her. She was this like really cool, young, Upper West Side, New York agent. And she had done books like Eco-Sex and books that really were not, they were not quite in the same wheelhouse. And so then I went to another agent, one of the other agents, who was like someone who scared the shit out of me. And I thought, she's so scary. Meanwhile, she sold the book in like a week or something. Like, she had me work for months on this proposal. And she micromanaged everything, and we sold the book. So, so that's that part of the story.
It's never easy.
It's never easy. It's always a process.
Well, let's talk a little bit more, because I'm sure that's part of what some of the people in the room would like to hear about. Like, you know, you have the dream. Part of my, I'll tell my story. Part of my dream was, even though I had done alternative journalism for a while, and I was, did rock and roll criticism and things like this, I wasn't a creative writer. And so I sort of fell backwards into academia, which is the least creative place in the world. And when, again, as I was hitting 50, I want to be creative. I would get up every morning and do morning pages. Anybody do morning pages?
I
right?
do morning pages.
So I'm doing my morning pages, and in my morning pages, every morning I would write, I am a writer. I can write. I am a writer. And telling myself this over and over again until I believed it. And now I own that. I call myself a writer first. I'm a writer who teaches, not a teacher who writes, right? So the owning of that makes a difference. But what the two of you are doing and have done, as far as, you know, I've got an idea, here's I'm writing my book proposal, I'm doing fiction and nonfiction and travel memoir, I'm doing all these different things. What's your morning look like?
I have no routine. I am the least routinized human being on the planet, I think. I abhor routine. So my mornings are whatever they are. I write when I am moved to write, and that's never the same time every day. And sometimes it's not. Like right now I'm taking a big break because I started a new book maybe 4 months ago, a book that I've wanted to write for a long time. And I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. I was very disciplined. I wrote for hours and hours every day, and decided I wanted to have 50 pages by whatever the date was. And I had my 50 pages, and then I started talking to people about, I don't have an agent right now, so I started talking to people about agents and publishers, and I was so disappointed by my friends who are pros in the business saying, no one's going to buy this book, that this is really tough, that I just decided that I'm going to take a break. So I'm not writing right now, and I miss writing. So I'll probably get back to it. It may not be on that book. I have a follow-up to this one that I'm halfway through, so I might do that. But I don't have any routine, and I know it works for a lot of people to say, I'm going to wake up and have my tea or coffee and then write for an hour or 2 hours or whatever. And, you know, that works for some people. For me, I just can't stop myself when I'm on a roll. So it doesn't matter when I do it.
When do you write? That's the question.
That's really interesting. I have a full-time job, so I actually I work remotely, but I travel back and forth from upstate New York to Washington a lot. And I had been traveling around the country, but I asked when I was writing the book if I could take a travel break. So I got that break. That's done now. I was in Washington last week too. But I get up in the morning and I read. I go through I have two different routines. When I am really disciplined and when I'm in the thick of writing, I do the artist's way, which is the morning pages. And I never took the actual class or one of the workshops, but I have a really good friend who did, and she did the really intensive one, and she told me every day, right, I can't remember, three pages. And I have a big notebook that I like not just, you know, one of my kids' old ones. I got a really nice notebook, and because she said you won't do it if you don't. And I do. And what I do, it's an interesting process. I read the whole book. If you're a writer or an aspiring writer, I totally recommend getting The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. Because it's pretty incredible how it works, and it does work, which is really interesting to me as you do it. It's kind of like a meditation in writing. So the way I do it is I dump all the crap out in the morning on these morning pages. I write, but I focus it on writing. You're not supposed to really talk about them, but I'm not part of a group, so I'll just tell you. So I focus on my writing, like yesterday, I actually, my routine is to stop working at some point during my day when nobody knows and start working on my other project. But in the morning, I take at least an hour and a half. I get up at 7, and by 8:30, I have to be online and kind of tuned into my email and my work schedule. So I write in the morning, but now that when I'm not writing, I read in the morning. And I read writers that inspire me, not necessarily in my genre, and actually not in my genre. I read the writers that inspire me, that I like. I love their writing. Right now I'm reading old Dani Shapiro's. She has a wonderful book on writing, but her latest book, Inheritance, is incredible. So I write that kind of I read personal narratives, and that's basically it. But I have to say that being a full-time worker and a writer, and they've offered me I have another book in the hopper. It's challenging, and I could not have done this when my children were younger. It's just now, like I said, I feel like smarter, stronger, and I'm more passionate about it. So, and I make the time.
Right, the making of the time, and it also seems to me like you were both compelled, right? Part of the writing, there was something. It was something that you absolutely had to do, and I almost feel like for both of you there was a spiritual element to it almost, in this sort of compelling, I have to do this. Could you speak to a little bit of that? Like,
Sure.
you were talking about, it came from somewhere.
Well, that was that was an anomaly for me. I mean, these two books, the story of these two books was something that, as I said, was with me for 40 years. And I kept thinking, somebody's going to do it, somebody's going to do it. And actually, a couple of people did do it horribly. And so, it was kind of a moment of, if not now, when. And it was a long process. It was 15 years before it came to fruition. What was your question again? Oh, spirituality. So I don't think that I separate spirituality from anything else in my life because I'm not a religious person. So I've never had that separation. In fact, I'm a third-generation atheist, raised by people who hate all religions and thought that religion was the root of all evil. And I don't know if I believe that as strongly as they did, but I never had a religious practice until I started meditating. And I started meditating about 40 years ago. And meditation has just been one of the biggest gifts that I ever received. And if I separate spirituality at all, it's in meditation, when I'm actually meditating. And I don't meditate every day anymore. Sometimes it's only 5 minutes a day. Sometimes it's an hour. Sometimes it's 2 hours. But as I said, I'm not very routinized. But spirituality, I mean, I see what people would call holiness or God. I see that in children, I see it in a sunset, I see it in flowers. I just see it in my life and appreciate it. And I think that the appreciation of that is probably as close to spirituality as I get.
And do you... Hello.
Hello.
So do you see that as part of your writing practice? So when you were...
I don't
wouldn't call
separate it.
You don't separate it.
Yeah, I mean,
Because I have no separation of spirituality as such, I
Because
don't know
people
how to
always
answer
want to
that.
know where people get their ideas, where do you get your ideas from? And so what is part of that? Because you do a lot of writing.
Well,
You're very prolific
all of
when
my,
you're writing.
well, all of my books, really, except for these two, except for the historical fiction, all of my books are about my life experiences, basically, or the things that I've learned. All of the nonfiction books were about everything that I learned, and I was my own science experiment for all of that. So everything that I learned, and then the results, and then all the research. Yeah, so I don't feel like writing is a choice for me, really. It's just kind of what I'm driven to do.
and the question is spirituality.
So I'm also not very spiritual, but I'm like a worker bee, and that's like what drives me. And I wasn't, which is really interesting. I was kind of lazy, and I never felt really like I met expectations. Like and this goes back. Now we're getting very psychological, but this goes back to, you go through your family, and like my brother went to Stanford, and I went to like SUNY New Paltz, and so I was always like the social one, and he was always like the brainiac. So like in your families, you kind of fall into these patterns. So when I broke out of that pattern, which wasn't seriously till I was 50, I took a very easy job in a private school. I didn't want to teach public school. I wanted to be like this. I worked in this little hippy-dippy private school, progressive school, and it wasn't easy once I became the director, and then I kind of decided to jump ship because I had kind of had it. But I came into my own at one point. I just realized that like I have all this creative energy and I can feel that creative energy. So actually now that you mention it, it's not really spiritual. I feel it's an energetic thing. I bet Sean could talk to this because talk about prolific. I mean, have you read it? Have you heard his poems? Anyway, you know, and that's what drives me. So I find that this energy makes me this kind of worker bee, and I get so much satisfaction from this kind of writing and this like personal narrative woven with issues, with an issue that is important to me. That means something to me, and the regulatory system in the United States really means something to me because we can see what's happening with disease among women and men in this country, and once I started digging into it, I was like, oh yeah, we know exactly where this is coming from. Like the chemical lobby is lobbying, and you know, we're not at some of our regular, you know, the things that should be, formaldehyde is not even regulated. We can't get it regulated. I mean, and it shows up in, you know, there's lead in lipstick, and it goes on and on. It's all, a lot, some of this is all in the book, but that's not it's not the main part of the book. But when we start, that's kind of my passion. So when I look at those, I'm driven by passion more than spiritual, because I'm also not really a religious person. So I can't draw from that. So I'm drawing from my passions.
And a lot of energy. So with that energy, maybe I think it's time for us to start our readings, right? Do you both know what you're interested in reading from? Which pieces?
Yeah, I decided, yes.
Wrap it up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I actually decided that because that to read from, and I have to get it.
I'll hold this one for you while you read.
Yeah, okay.
It might be easier.
So it's really interesting. When I wrote once the book was in the pipeline, I sent a query letter, which is what freelance writers do, to InStyle magazine, saying, I would love to write about this kind of going gray thing, because I found that it's sociological, it affects most women. 75% of all women have used hair dye at some point in their lives. Sometimes it's teenagers, sometimes it's, but to cover gray hair is the most common. So I had this editor who said, this is great. And so the first manuscript I sent to them, of course, they stripped all the chemical stuff out because that, you know, and this is all in the book, which I do talk about how editorial copy is really dictated by advertisers, and we know this. This is kind of, but she turned to me and she said, "I'm going to give you the title. You're going to write the piece." And I was like, okay, so here's the title she gave me. I thought this is kind of interesting. And of course, a lot of this is in the book too. Most of it's in the book. But this is much more concise. So the title she gave me was, I Embraced My Gray Hair, But Nobody Else Did. So at some point, left to its own devices, hair turns gray. And not counting the legions of milky-haired young things chasing the shade right now, women tend to run for cover when that happens, as I had been for more than 2 decades. Keeping my hair color close to its original dark shade helped me feel I could control aging. For the last few years, I had gone to my hairstylist every 4 to 6 weeks for color. I live 2 hours north of New York City, and in this neck of the woods, my treatments clocked in around $250, including cut, blow dry, tips. Plus, I needed the occasional in-between root touch-up for another $50. I was basically a meal ticket. So I wasn't surprised at how she reacted when I said I was quitting color. Mark my words, you'll become invisible, she warned, aiming her dye-stained wand at me as if to cast a social expiration spell. But I had enough. Like Prada once said, that women try to tame themselves when they get older, but instead they should be striving to be more wild. I wanted in. Down the rabbit hole of going gray inspiration on Instagram and Pinterest, I found so much silver hair beauty to covet. Once brunettes, blondes, and redheads, this boomer sisterhood were bucking the standard of age-appropriate behavior by refusing to cover the gray to stay visible and current. Their swagger and optimism wooed me with the promise of radically honest hair. What I did not predict was that owning my gray and embracing it were not entirely up to me, that I would be setting myself up for the reactions of everyone else and their presumptive, outdated ideas about hair, youth, and beauty. When my hairdresser urged me to reconsider quitting, despite my reasons, which were the upkeep, the costs, the chemicals, by saying a young face can get away with anything, I was only more resolute. I wasn't giving up, and nor was I attempting to get away with anything. I just wanted to be myself. I grew out my long, densely dark, straight hair without the intervention of highlights, lowlights, balayage, or any other enhancer. Cold turkey. Now I can see the attributes of those rebellious women of a certain age coming into focus daily. I wear my reimagined beauty, shining silver hair with pride. It's now high summer, and my Hudson Valley neighbors celebrate the bounty of the season at our local's farmers market. Sundays are weekly social events, and in between discussing the merits of eating squash blossoms and foraging for elusive chicken of the woods mushrooms, the subject of my long silver mane slides in. I feel like a pregnant woman trying to avoid getting petted by strangers. It's open season for comments about my hair. Are you doing that on purpose? An acquaintance I hadn't seen for a while asked. As I answered that indeed I was, she cut me off to ask what my husband thought about it. Then she went on to tell me why she couldn't stop coloring her hair. Being single, she couldn't afford to make the mistake of appearing older. She went so far as to recommend another shade I might try, honey blonde. Men seem to like it. In my normally progressive town, I couldn't believe I was hearing such outdated and patently sexist beauty talk. So I tossed off a jokey response about how we have an open marriage, and he's openly gray too. Later that evening, sipping rosé at an outdoor dinner party, I saw my husband in deep conversation with a male friend, eavesdropping across the lawn. I expected to hear political banter and was surprised when instead I heard, "How do you feel about your wife's gray hair?" I mulled over why no one had ever asked whether I liked my husband's salt and pepper hair, or why the phrase salt and pepper hair is exclusively reserved for men. Well, women go gray, as if in defeat. And then I heard my usually earnest husband jokingly respond that it's like being with a blonde. What the hell? When the friend's wife and I moseyed over to the conversation, he suggested she go gray, like I had. "Oh, it looks good on you," she said, sizing me up, but I could never stop coloring. My hair is thinning and curly, and hair dye gives it life. In my book, I talk about hair dye. To me, now it feels like death. But simmering under the surface of these conversations is an endless source of aging frustration, wrinkles, extra pounds, sagging breasts. If hair color is life-affirming for my friend, I certainly can't blame her for wanting that. But it wasn't what I wanted. Nevertheless, the topic of my socially unacceptable hair seemed to follow me around town. Next, it was the bank. I've been going to the same bank for years, and the teller never asked me for my ID anymore. But after my hair dye moratorium, she summoned my license. She eyed me up and down, checking my much younger mug in the photo. "Wow, you look so different. It's so interesting to see how people age. Would you like to learn more about our retirement offerings?" I wasn't even 60 yet. And speaking of working, as a remote employee, I don't race into the office every day, so I hadn't seen how my uncolored hair would fare in a work environment. At a recent lunch meeting with an executive I hadn't seen for a while, a woman I admired for her intellect and steadfast kindness, I was greeted with a personal question. "You have such a young face. Why would you do that to your pretty appearance?" Sputtering out my going gray mantra, perhaps a little too quickly, I got tired of the upkeep, the cost, I pulled back, realizing that being devalued at work was not quite the same as being judged at the farmer's market or the bank. Instead of readying my soapbox, I changed the subject. I got the message, loud and clear, that for the sake of my job and relationships, I needed to stay visible, vital, attractive, sexy. By striving for and embracing widely held beauty norms, I guess I had been delusional to think I could age naturally, gracefully, without fallout. But if I've got enough life experience to go gray, I also have enough to know that I can't control other people's opinions or comments about my looks. What I can control is whether I choose to take them seriously. So sure, I'm sensitive to judgments from others, and sidestepping all these comments was exhausting. But I've gone gray, and I'm embracing it, whether the crowd's coming with me or not.
But I have to
Oh.
ask you to hold it because
Absolutely.
because I can't use one hand for my book, I don't think. And I also hope I can see it. I'm going to read from notes from abroad, that being me. And this is, I'll just quickly introduce, I'm going to start with the second chapter, which kind of gives you the background. When I turned 70, the year before I turned 70, everyone kept asking me what I was going to do for my 70th birthday. And the only answer that was consistent was, I really want to go to Italy. And I kind of honed it over a whole year and decided I wanted to go to Italy for a whole year and learn to speak Italian. I've grown up speaking Sicilian, hearing it, but not really speaking it. But I wanted to, every time I went to Italy, I thought, one of these days, I just want to be here. I want to cook here. I want to go to the farmer's market here. And so that's what led up to it. And I did it on my 70th birthday. Okay. So, Chapter 2, The Negroni Chronicles. Does everybody know what a Negroni is?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Today is the 10th of June, a date I always celebrate because it's Malone's birthday, my daughter's godfather and dearest friend who died of AIDS 27 years ago, way too young and entirely too soon. All these years later, he is still very present in my life, and how I wish he were here now, sipping a Negroni at Bar Florio in Piazza San Domenico, cruising all the beautiful straight men with facial hair. The image makes me smile. I've been living in Italy for 5 weeks, and have had more sex in the last 2 than I've had in the last 2 years. My handsome ex-lover Vittorio just stopped by my table to kiss me on both cheeks on his way home from his studio where he practices law. So it must be 7 p.m. Church bells ring every 15 minutes here to tell me the time, and fortunately cease at 10 p.m. I'm seldom asleep until many hours later, as my current lover, Tonio, rarely leaves me before 1. Exhausted, sore, and content despite a gnawing desire for my ex-boyfriend Luke in California. This realization brings me a rare moment of truth, filled with an emptiness I tend not to acknowledge to myself and never to others. Were this not being notated on my iPad, the feeling would skulk back into the shadows unnoticed. A maudlin heaviness settles around me, and I know I'll sit here enveloped by it and drink alone, watching interchangeable young Italian men with beards, inhaling secondhand smoke and asking myself what the fuck I am doing. For me, reality always has 2 sides. So on the minus side, I recognize a gnawing feeling of emptiness that I can't seem to fill with the usual distractions, and my lack of progress in learning the Italian language is very frustrating. On the plus side, my tango is improving, and I'm living in an Italian dream in one of the most beautiful and romantic settings in the world. I met Vittorio, my first Italian lover, one balmy summer night during the first week of living in my new apartment in the ancient and very hip neighborhood of Villanova. My expat Aussie friends, Annie and John, had invited me to dinner at their house, and afterwards we walked downstairs to Bar Florio, the very lively social hub of the neighborhood. We stood outside in the tiny piazza sipping Negronis when one of their neighbors joined us with his friend Vittorio, a tall and classically beautiful Italian man, I guessed to be in his early 40s. There was obvious interest on both of our parts, and Annie shot me a "here's one for you" look. His eyes casually scanned me from feet to face, and his interest was obvious, as I'm accustomed to. I say this as a matter of fact rather than pride. Men describe me as a bombshell. One recent lover said I look like a Playboy bunny, and no one ever guesses my age within 20 years of accuracy. 25 years in the beauty industry and 10 as a professional dancer gave me beautiful skin and the stature and walk of a young athletic woman. Experience has made me certain of my sex appeal, which I am told makes me even more attractive to the opposite sex. The four of us stood around talking and drinking for over an hour until I began to fade. When I said I was going to leave, Vittorio asked where I lived. "Just around the corner," I replied. "I'll walk with you," he offered. Annie suppressed a squeal. I took his arm as we strolled through the narrow, charming cobbled streets of Villanova. When we reached my doorway, I thanked him for walking me and said good night, to which he reacted with surprise. "Are you not going to ask me in?" he said. "No, I don't think so," I replied with a laugh. "But why?" he asked, seemingly truly mystified. I laugh when I'm nervous, so when I stopped laughing, I said, "I'm not sure why. Maybe because we just met, maybe because I haven't been with anyone for more than a year, I don't know." Silently, my mind spun in different directions. I knew how much older than him I was, even if he didn't, and how could this way too young man ever be the age-appropriate mate I wished to meet? My dualistic nature rose to the surface as a familiar voice in my brain screamed, "He's gorgeous and Italian, are you nuts?" I know this voice as that of a much younger woman who resides in my subconscious and will not be dissuaded. Being a lawyer, Vittorio began to negotiate, which only made me laugh more. His English was not very good and sounded particularly funny as he tried to convince me of something he didn't really know how to say. I ended the debate by saying, "Give me your number and I'll call you after I've had a chance to think about it." Flabbergasted, he'd apparently never received such a response. Undressing for bed, I replayed the scene and asked myself why I hadn't wanted to sleep with him. It's one thing to appreciate a man's good looks, but another to take the next step to physically wanting him. If we had kissed, I might have been physically turned on. The next day when I told Annie, she was appalled. "Why the hell didn't you sleep with him? He's gorgeous and smart and gainfully employed." "I just wasn't turned on," I said. "Well, give him a call and another chance to flip your switch. He's perfect in my book," she said. So that is exactly what I did. Invited him to come over one night that week. Vittorio looks like my fantasy of the perfect Italian man. About 6'2" tall, with gorgeous green almond-shaped eyes under heavy black lashes, and thick light brown hair flecked with silver at the temples. He has a classic high-bridge patrician Roman nose, prominent cheekbones, and a square jaw. His legs are beautifully muscled from running, and his body is strong as well as almost hairless and deeply tanned. He's also very well endowed, and yet I felt very little sexual chemistry. What he had in physique, he lacked in sensuality. And worse, he wasn't a good kisser. There was also a problem when he tried speaking English in bed. This was my first experience of sex with a non-English speaking Italian man, and I soon discovered some things simply don't translate well. As we made love, he said a couple of things that made me giggle to myself, and when he was ready to come, he asked breathlessly, "Can I give you my sperm?" The thought that popped into my mind was, why? What do you want me to do with it? Of course, I laughed hysterically and then apologized profusely. I was looking up into the eyes of a gorgeous man who had just had a very good orgasm, and he looked perplexed and confused. It was a turnoff for me, and I assume for him as well, but despite my rude behavior, he wanted to see me again. Since initial encounters are rarely an accurate indication of compatibility, I agreed to give it another shot. During our second encounter, I asked Vittorio to only speak Italian while we were making love. He had a sexy voice and I liked hearing it, but unfortunately, the lovemaking was not much better, lacking focus and sensuality, and I felt zero connection. It probably didn't help the situation when I quietly sobbed afterwards, but the feeling of emptiness was so deep, the longing for what was missing in our exchange so profound, I couldn't help myself. In retrospect, I realized he was just a very immature lover. Meanwhile, back at Bar Florio, it's still twilight at 8 p.m. and the piazza is filled with people of all ages drinking their evening aperitivo as children run around playing. Andrea and Massimo, the handsome young owners, are setting up speakers and an electric keyboard outside, which makes me happy because it means there will be live music to dissipate my sadness. I look around the ancient piazza and realize that I may be lacking a loving relationship, but I'm in love with this place. 50 neighbors and strangers gathered outside for no other reason than to enjoy each other's company in the fading glow of soft colors on ancient buildings, the smell of pizza, the bitter orange taste of a Negroni, and the cacophony of children's laughter, dogs, and Italian voices. I'm just tipsy enough to feel brave and invite the handsome silver-haired man standing alone to please take the empty seat at my table. After all, it's early and I'm abroad, and comforted by the fact that we never know what the future holds. Anything might happen, and in a secret corner of my heart, I hope it will. In these maudlin moments, I wonder where love is for me and if I'll ever find it again and share it with someone. My first tango lesson with Tonio took place earlier this evening in his apartment. When he finished, he began to prepare dinner for one of his other lovers. I'm not jealous that he has sex with other women, but that he cooks for them. When I admitted this, he thought I was kidding. The pleasure I feel when a man cooks for me is equivalent to the way most women feel when being taken to an expensive restaurant. Watching a man cook me food turns me on, and I have no idea why. I only had one lover a very long time ago who really cooked for me, but I love watching a man's hands chop and stir. I like being fed. Suddenly, I dive back to my childhood where my mother was a terrible cook, and I'm watching my father make me farmer's salad, the only childhood meal I ever thought delicious. Could this be why men preparing food makes me happy? At the time, I didn't know that Tonio bought prepared food from the local market and simply warmed it up. This does not count as preparing dinner in my world. The band is warming up now, and a keyboard, a violinist, what else? Maybe I'll get to sing tonight. My aperitivo plate of prosciutto, salami, assorted cheeses, olives, and Sardinian cracker bread arrives as Vittorio reappears wearing the new neon running shoes he proudly tells me he had to order specially online because they don't carry his extra large size here. Sigh, but there's no chemistry for me, which is lucky since he's brought his young friend Francesca, who may be his girlfriend. She speaks almost no English, but we communicate perfectly in my broken Italian, And it's a girl thing. We understand each other without words. Girlfriends are like lovers in this, I think. And by the end of the evening, she and I are best friends. I can see the closeness between her and Vittorio, and also her keen observations of his nature and how she calls him on things. She's clearly his intellectual equal and a lot more mature. Almost everyone seems more mature than Vittorio, and he's 42. They join my table with 2 other friends, and I feel happy to be surrounded by energetic young Italians. The band and vocalists begin to play, and they're terrible, with a maudlin sound, the audio equivalent of paint by numbers. They play That Was a Very Good Year and Fly Me to the Moon, songs I disliked when I was young, and they were popular. I wonder why they think the songs are cool, or if they just like Frank Sinatra. None of them, I'm sorry, I skipped something. To compensate, I drink 3 Negronis, and when I mispronounce it as Negrone, Francesca lets me know how bad my mispronunciation is. It is, she says, the N word with the E on the end, instead of the proper I. Feeling appalled, I thank her, and then tell them the story of my fig faux pas. None of them can stop laughing. It definitely tops Negroni. So, my fig faux pas. At the end of my second week in Sardinia, I joined a group of foreigners from my language school for a field trip to the most prestigious winery on the island, Cantina Argiolas. Following the winemaking tour, the 12 of us were shown into the tasting room and seated at a lovely long wooden table, laden with olives, cheeses, sliced prosciutto and salami, fruits, and of course, wines. With guidance from one of the winery's expert presenters, we tasted and nibbled for an hour. Towards the end, when the fruits were being offered with the dessert wine, people began to share their opinions and preferences. Carefully pulling a phrase out of my brain in perfect Italian, I held my wine glass aloft and proudly declared, "Mi piace mangiare fica con questo vino." Everyone at the table who understood Italian froze. I surveyed the silent guests as an elderly Englishwoman leaned towards me and said quietly in an upper-crust British accent, "I'm afraid you've just said something rather nasty." I held my breath. "You see," she explained, "the singular word for fig is actually slang for a woman's private part. The plural ficae is always used for the actual fruit. I had just said I enjoyed eating pussy with the dessert wine."
Thank you so much for the readings, and we have some time for some Q&A. Yeah?
5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes? Any questions for our readers and writers who are reading?
No, everyone's so
No
shy.
questions.
No questions. Okay.
Come on, no writing questions?
Yes.
Yes?
For either one of you or both of you, do you find that you just write whatever you're thinking about, or do you start planning things out first? I know some people like to try to do an outline of how the book's going to go, or do you just free it the whole time?
Well, I do journal, so I don't plan what I'm journaling. I just write whatever it is that I wanted to talk about or a reaction I had to something. So that's not planned. And when I have a project that I want to write, I first just write. I just sit down and write. And I wait until I have a big batch, and then I kind of consider and look, and then do an outline, as it were, or with a nonfiction book, it would be an outline. With fiction, I do it that way. With nonfiction, I would have an outline first and then write it. So it's kind of different for each. But I will give you the best advice that was ever given to me when I was writing my first book in 1980. And this advice came from a friend of mine who was an author who had had a pretty successful book. And he said, you have to wear two hats when you write. First, you're the weaver, and you weave the cloth. And then you're the tailor, and you take the cloth and make it into a suit. But confusing your writing with your editing, which is what that is, stops you. It stops your writing. So I have always written just very freely. I don't worry about if the sentence is good, if the word is correct, if there's a better word, blah, blah, blah. I just get it all out, and then I go back and polish it.
That's really interesting. Thank you for
Didn't I ever
that.
tell you that?
I don't know. Maybe one of those, like, whatever you were pouring one of those nights.
Tequila-driven evenings.
Tequila-driven evenings, yeah. She introduced me to tequila. Who knew there was such a, like, varied amount of tequila in the world? I write personal narrative and nonfiction. I don't write any fiction, actually. And my personal narrative kind of asks questions. So I'll have an experience, and from that will come a question. Like I met someone on I met a dermatologist. It was really interesting on the train from DC to New York, and he was really interested in my, I was like had this like crazy two-toned hair, it was like white and dyed dark hair on the bottom. And he said, you look honest. And I thought, well, there's a nice thing to say. And then he turned to me and he said, like, he said, if you ever want want to talk to me about anything, here's my card. Which he was kind of flirting, which was kind of nice too. And I thought a dermatologist, he was actually a plastic surgeon. I'm sorry. Who was talking about anti-aging, and I said, so, your whole job is anti-aging, and I'm like embracing my aging. And he said, why would anybody be anti-aging? Why would you be against aging? So from there, I took that and I started researching about anti-aging. So I would take a personal narrative that I had. I talk about in the book about a friend who has cancer, but I do it I give it a very light touch. I don't get heavily into her cancer, but here she is bald, and I'm having this, hair crisis, which is like ridiculous considering, she's losing her hair at this time. And we're having these conversations, and from there, I learned that cancer is like a take no prisoners hairstyle, and I go from there and keep going. And so I take these personal narrative pieces, and that's what kind of drives my questioning. The whole idea of when women go through all this menopausal angst, and maybe my decision to to let something change in my beauty had to do with the fact that I was in hot flash hell, and I would take that and kind of move that envelope. So that's how I approach. My writing is really personal narrative that kind of then gets into the science of it. I don't know if that answers your question. But
It was actually your
your
question.
question, your question, right? How do we do that? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is for both of you. The moderator, sorry, I forget your name.
Kelly.
But, okay, Kelly pointed out that often when you're older, you're writing more from the star versus the wound, which can be very liberating.
From what?
I'm sorry. When you're older, you're writing more from the scar versus the wound, which can be very liberating.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
That's what your moderator said.
Yes.
So she said, and what I take from that is that it can be very liberating then because you're writing more from a sense of acceptance and reflection.
Yes.
But I'm wondering if you both could speak on, though, while that can be liberating for you, do you still worry about other people that might not be so accepting of your truth? And how you go about when you're writing, like, reflective narrative or memoir, do you feel like you need to talk to those people in your story? Do you care as much?
That's interesting.
That's a good question. And actually, that's why I titled the book the way that I titled it. So I was very concerned about that because I didn't want anybody who was going to be offended by this picking it up and going, "Oh my God!" So that's why I titled it Notes from Abroad, My Uncensored Year in Italy. So that just kind of tells you right there. And then, if that was not enough, the description on the back begins, "Fuck getting older." So I thought if anyone is offended by that, they just won't buy the book. And that's really what I wanted.
And that's a really interesting question because I have had people, I've done a bunch of book talks now, and a bunch of book talks I've had like hundreds of people that I've talked to about the book, and the book is really selling. I thought it would just sell. There's like this kind of going gray crowd, and they are like clamoring for information on like how to do it, why did you do it. There's these, and I knew that the book would catch them, but I have a political bent in this book. There's politics in it, and I write right up front. Like, I thought about very hard and carefully about, I don't know if I can find it right now, about writing, inserting a political kind of something into the process of a hair story. Basically, it's a hair story, but I think that in this day and age and what's going on in the world right now, I feel, and the fact that I work incredibly intimately in the environmental world, in the environmental science world, and what's happening in science and how science is being censored, and how our politics are so polarized, and how our current regulatory systems, the EPA, the FDA, are compromised by the current administration, that I actually feel very strongly about it, and I had to write about that, and I did. I also, and I would say I've gotten 98% overwhelmingly. I'm so glad you infused that into your story, because you're writing about regulations. And now granted, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, and let's just get right down to it, everybody needs to stay healthy. I mean, that's the bottom line, and that's what we need. We need things to stay, we need our regulations to keep us healthy. And if we have chemicals that the chemical lobby is pushing to make sure that it doesn't go through because it's cheaper, and of course the beauty industry and the personal care industry will continue to follow step because it's cheap. It's all about money. It's really all about, it's the same thing in the fossil fuel industry. It's the same thing in the pharmaceutical industry. This is what it's all about. They will change their formulas if there's demand. If women boycott these products, and I talk a lot about that in the book and some of the chemicals in the book. There are certain ones, I mean, I was putting coal tar on my head. Dark dyes are coal tar derivatives. So, and the investigative journalism that I did to get to this point really excited me. I have done this before on articles, never to this extent. And anyway, I don't want to get heavily into that, but that actually, I had to think really long and hard about that, because it meant that I might be losing half of the amount of people that might buy my book. And also, as it turns out, I've gotten a lot of press about the book, lots and lots and lots of press, all positive press. But some of the beauty magazines won't touch it, because, and I talk about that. I talk about a really interesting incident with Ms. Magazine about how we've known about the chemicals in hair products since the 70s, and Gloria Steinem wrote about a very small congressional a congressional regulatory report that Clairol, who was their #1 advertiser, said, you have to pull that out of your magazine. And she said, no, I'm not pulling it out of the magazine. Newsweek at this time, in the 70s, 80s, Newsweek was writing about it. And she said, all the other ones, but the women's magazines were not taken seriously at that point. And so they said, you got to take it out, or we will never give you any ad copy for the rest of your natural life. And so she said, okay. And Ms. Magazine almost went under because Clairol. So it's really, there's this kind of twisted web that goes through it, and I felt it was my obligation, along with that fun story that I wrote for InStyle, along with all the age angst of letting my hair go gray, and even though I love my dark hair and all of that, I felt really strongly that I had to do that. That's kind of, as an environmental journalist, I needed to do that. So thank you for asking.
Okay, and we're at time, so thank everyone for coming, and we appreciate your time. We're going to take a little break.
We're going to roll right into the open mic.
Oh, we're going to roll right into the open mic. Yay! Mike.
Are we singing?
If you want to.
You can sing.